The thing that bothers me most in BioShock, after the story, are the Vita chambers. They're essentially respawn points. Dying will make you materialise in the nearest chamber, a little the worse for wear, but otherwise okay. This idea is of course in System Shock 2 as well. In Shock 2, these things work in exactly the same way, the one difference being that there's a charge associated with them in the form of money. This means that, in System Shock 2, you are never taken out of the gameplay experience. When you die, there's no saving or loading, or any of the usual rigmarole involved in computer game death. But because it costs money, it still brings with it a tangible loss that means death is an undesirable event. It's perfect. It costs you something precious, something finite, something that would otherwise be used to help you through the game, and you don't have to bother with computer gamey things like loading and saving that take you out of the game experience. In BioShock, on the other hand, while the Vita chambers get you past all the loading and saving and that stuff, there's no sense of loss associated with death, as they cost nothing to use. You can literally do a one-man Zerg rush on an enemy like a Big Daddy, spamming him over and over with melee attacks, dying and respawning again and again. In other words, you can take down the toughest enemies in the game without it costing you a thing except your own real life time. And after complaints about the extra easy difficulty resulting from Vita chambers, when patching the game, rather than add a cost to them, which already proved so effective in System Shock 2 as a spam deterrent if as nothing else, rather than do that, they just added an option to disable the Vita chamber, which brings in a sense of loss and failure. But it also brings back the other problem associated with computer game death, loading and saving and out-of-game menus and all that jazz. The fact that they get it so right in System Shock 2, and then not once but twice screwed it up in BioShock, is beyond my comprehension. The craziest thing about BioShock is that it's played as a horror game. The story naturally lends itself to the horrific, and they pull a bunch of really mediocre shock scares on you throughout, the lowliest rung on the horror ladder. And they occasionally toy with darkness and smoke to reduce visibility. With Vita chambers enabled, it's absolutely impossible to feel any sense of personal danger. God mode is active, making the game weak as a horror experience. Even with Vita chambers off, well, like I've said before, BioShock is so absurdly easy that it doesn't really matter. There are so many resources, and the game is so empowering, that all attempts to make you feel afraid are misguided and ineffectual. BioShock's visual experience is very double-edged. On the one hand, the 1940s Art Deco style is extremely cool, and even if you don't like it, it's something that's never been done in a game before, at least not so well. Rapture is a very coherent and believable world, and a lot of that comes from the artistic style. The problem I have with the visuals is the engine. Everything looks like it's made of plastic. Now, I'm a big fan of games with unusual visual styles, games like Team Fortress 2 being amongst my very favourite. But where Team Fortress 2's fatuous look is a reflection of the game's offbeat style, BioShock's plastic look is at odds with its attempt to tell a serious story, and with the way so much of it is played as a horror. I find it impossible to be intimidated, or indeed anything but amused, by enemies that look like they've been built out of modelling clay. It's not something I'm going to criticise too harshly. I'm a complete graphical apologist, finding most games released this side of the millennium very visually impressive in one way or another. But the fact that the visual style is so at odds with the overall tone of the game is perplexing. It's yet another way that the game undermines itself with conflicting elements that don't work well together. For all that I've said, I don't hate this game. I just don't think it's the genre-defining work of art the industry seems to believe it is. In fact, I don't even think it's a bad game. The score I've awarded it is a 3 out of 5, or OK, which is exactly what I think BioShock is. It's OK. The game is filled with brilliant ideas, but falls short on the execution for the most part. Some elements, like the gene tonics and research, do a good job of reimagining complex RPG elements in a run and gunner. Others, like hacking, gene banks, and Vita chambers, are self-sabotaging. And a lot of people will say I'm judging the game wrong. I'm treating it like a complex RPG when I should be looking at it as a dumb FPS, or whatever. The reason I can't do that is because it obviously isn't. The only way the game would be a dumb FPS is if all the RPG elements were taken out. But instead, they're in the game, and they are both teasing at something so much better, while also simultaneously making it worse than it would have been had they been completely absent. I am certain that BioShock would have been a better game if it had worked just like a typical FPS, with things like gene tonics and plasmids all being given to you like weapons are in an FPS. Just look at Crysis as an example of how brilliantly an ability-driven, pure FPS can play out. Either that, or go the opposite route and take the RPG mechanics close to their extremes like System Shock 2 did. It's the sitting in the middle that ruins BioShock. It's neither here nor there, and it doesn't work as either an FPS or as an RPG. Plasmids are cool, but under and improperly utilised. Rapture is stunning in concept, and it's certainly the only game I've played set in an underwater city. But then again, that city is structurally identical to the Half-Life research complex, to System Shock 2's spaceship, or to Escape from Butcher Bay's prison, being different only aesthetically. And of course, there's the story. The fact that it's almost a one-to-one recreation of System Shock 2's story, with only mild changes, like setting it in an underwater city rather than on a spaceship, makes it impossible for me to truly enjoy the experience. But for all my earlier complaining, I am glad that it's a story that people are experiencing, even if they're doing so in the wrong game. I believe Shock 2's story is the greatest ever told in a game, certainly in terms of the narrative structure, and there is something to be said for any game that is able to put that story out there. BioShock does some things right, it does a lot of things wrong, but regardless of all of that, it is the low-intellect doppelganger of a game released in 1999, 8 years before BioShock. That Shock 2 was not very popular was obviously the driving force behind BioShock's design philosophy, and BioShock certainly has been popular, but popularity and quality rarely go hand in hand.